There are statements that shift diplomatic temperatures. There are statements that move financial markets. And then there are statements that detonate inside the architecture of the global economy like a depth charge dropped into still water, sending shockwaves outward in every direction simultaneously, reaching shores their author may not have even intended to hit. Donald Trump just made one of those statements. In a declaration that stunned allied capitals, rattled energy markets, paralyzed Gulf state diplomatic circuits, and forced every major oil importing nation on Earth to run emergency scenario assessments overnight, the President of the United States announced that the United States Navy would enforce a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, not a threat, not a negotiating position wrapped in diplomatic language, not a carefully worded statement designed to preserve maximum ambiguity while signaling maximum resolve. A declaration, direct, unambiguous, delivered in the blunt transactional vocabulary that has become the signature of Trump's second administration. The United States Navy will blockade the Strait of Hormuz. 5 words that may represent the single most consequential geopolitical sentence spoken by an American president in a generation. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not a geographic feature. It is not simply a body of water connecting the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea. It is the jugular vein of the global economy, and the President of the United States just announced his intention to place his hand on it. The world is still calculating what that means. This analysis is where that calculation begins. Before you can understand what Trump's declaration means, you need to understand precisely what the Strait of Hormuz is and why every word spoken about it moves markets, mobilizes navies, and forces heads of government out of bed at 3 a.m. to convene emergency meetings with their energy ministers. The strait sits between the southern coast of Iran to the north and the Musandam Peninsula of Oman and the United Arab Emirates to the south. At its narrowest navigable point, it measures approximately 33 kilometers across. Within that narrow passage, the internationally recognized shipping lanes are even tighter. 2 lanes for inbound traffic, 2 lanes for outbound, each roughly 3 kilometers wide, separated by a 2-kilometer buffer zone. Through those lanes, every single day, moves approximately 17 to 21 million barrels of crude, oil, and petroleum products. The precise figure fluctuates with production levels and seasonal demand patterns. But the order of magnitude is consistent, and has been for decades. Roughly 1/5 of all the oil consumed on Earth transits the Strait of Hormuz every day. Not some of it, not most of it in certain seasons. 1/5 every day, without interruption. The numbers downstream from that single figure are staggering. Saudi Arabia's entire oil export economy, the revenue base that funds the kingdom's government, its social contract with its citizens, its Vision 2030 transformation program, its regional military posture, passes through Hormuz, the UAE's exports, Kuwait's exports, Iraq's southern exports, which account for the overwhelming majority of Baghdad's government revenue, Qatar's liquefied natural gas, which heats homes across Europe and powers industrial facilities across Asia. All of it, every barrel, every cubic meter, through 33 kilometers of water. Japan imports approximately 90% of its crude oil from the Persian Gulf. South Korea imports approximately 70%. India's rapidly growing economy depends on Gulf crude for the majority of its energy needs. China, the world's largest oil importer, sources approximately 40% of its total crude imports through the Strait of Hormuz. When Trump said the U.S. Navy would blockade the Strait of Hormuz, he was not describing a military operation. He was describing the potential interruption of the energy metabolism of the entire industrialized world simultaneously. The immediate question every analyst, every energy trader, every head of government asked upon hearing Trump's declaration was the same. Against whom? For what purpose? Under what legal framework? And with what endgame? The context matters enormously, and it has been building for months. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign against Iran, relaunched with significantly greater intensity in his second term than even in his first, had by mid-2026 reached an inflection point. Iranian oil exports, which had recovered to relatively substantial levels during the Biden years despite sanctions nominally remaining in place, were being targeted with an enforcement ferocity that Iran's Asian customers, primarily China, were finding increasingly difficult to circumvent. Treasury Department secondary sanctions were being applied to Chinese refineries purchasing Iranian crude, forcing Beijing to make increasingly uncomfortable choices between its Iranian energy relationship and its access to the American financial system. Iran's response to this mounting pressure had followed a predictable escalation pathway: acceleration of uranium enrichment activities, harassment of commercial shipping in the Gulf, proxy force activations across the region, and most provocatively, public statements from IRGC commanders threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz in response to what Tehran characterized as economic warfare against the Iranian people. Trump's Hormuz blockade declaration was his response to that threat. A counterpunch delivered in the only rhetorical register Trump operates in: total escalation dominance. You threaten to close the strait, I announce I am blockading it. Your move. The logic, from Trump's perspective, follows a straight line. Iran's leverage over the global economy derives from its ability to threaten Hormuz. Remove that leverage, or more precisely, demonstrate the willingness to seize control of that leverage yourself, and you fundamentally restructure the negotiating dynamic. Iran cannot threaten something that the United States has already announced it controls, whether that logic holds under the weight of operational reality, international law, allied relationships, and the cascading economic consequences of even a temporary Hormuz disruption. That is the question. The legal architecture of a Hormuz blockade is one of the most complex questions in contemporary international law, and it matters enormously because it determines who stands with Washington and who stands against it. Under international law, a blockade is an act of war. Full stop. It is not a sanctions measure. It is not an enforcement action. It is not a navigational rights dispute. A naval blockade, the physical prevention of vessels from transiting a waterway, constitutes, under the laws of armed conflict as codified in international, legal tradition dating from the 1856 Declaration of Paris through the modern San Remo Manual on International Law, applicable to armed conflicts at sea, an act of belligerency that gives the blockaded party legal justification to respond with force. This creates an immediate and severe problem for Washington. A blockade of Hormuz is not a blockade of Iranian territorial waters. The strait itself sits in a zone of complex, overlapping legal regimes. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, to which the United States is not a signatory but whose customary international law provisions it formally recognizes in operational practice, vessels have a right of transit passage through straits used for international navigation. The Strait of Hormuz is the definitive example of such a strait. Interrupting transit passage through it does not just affect Iran. It affects every nation whose shipping uses the waterway, which means virtually every significant maritime economy on Earth. The United States would be imposing a blockade that legally harms Japan, South Korea, India, China, the European nations, importing Gulf LNG, and the Gulf states themselves, whose oil exports fund American allied governments across the region. The legal exposure is extraordinary. The diplomatic exposure is worse. NATO allies would face an impossible choice: support the blockade and absorb the economic damage of disrupted energy supplies. Oppose it and fracture the most important security alliance in the world at a moment when Russian aggression in Europe demands maximum alliance cohesion. The Europeans, already managing significant internal political stress over energy costs, defense spending demands, and immigration pressures, would be placed in a position that no allied government would survive domestically if it simply acquiesced. This is why Trump's declaration, within hours of being made, produced an extraordinary volume of urgent, classified diplomatic traffic between Washington and every major allied capital simultaneously. London, Berlin, Paris, Tokyo, Seoul, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi. All of them seeking clarification, seeking reassurance, seeking any indication that the declaration was a negotiating posture rather than an operational order. The Gulf states occupy the most uncomfortable position of any parties in this drama. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Iraq are, in the most literal possible sense, the primary economic victims of any Hormuz closure or disruption, regardless of whether that disruption comes from Iranian mines or an American blockade. Their oil, their gas, their government revenues, their economic futures all sit on the other side of those 33 kilometers of water. They need Hormuz open more than anyone else on Earth. And yet the Gulf states also need American security guarantees more than almost anyone else on Earth. The U.S. Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. American air assets are based in Qatar. American ground forces are stationed across the region. The Gulf Cooperation Council's defense posture is structurally dependent on American military presence in a way that cannot be replaced by any other security arrangement in any reasonable time frame. So when Trump says he is blockading Hormuz, the Gulf states cannot simply say what they actually think. They cannot publicly oppose an American president's military declaration without risking the security relationship their regimes depend on for survival. They cannot support it without appearing to endorse an action that would directly harm their own economies and potentially trigger Iranian retaliation against their territory. Qatar's LNG facilities, the UAE's oil infrastructure, Saudi Aramco's terminal at Ras Tanura, all of these are within range of Iranian ballistic missiles and drone systems. Riyadh's diplomatic response was characteristically careful. Public statements expressed support for regional stability and international navigation rights. Private communications through back channels conveyed something considerably more alarmed. The Saudis have spent years building a complex regional architecture that includes not just their American security relationship, but also the tenuous diplomatic normalization with Iran that Chinese mediation produced in 2023. A full American-Iranian military confrontation centered on Hormuz would detonate that entire regional architecture simultaneously. China's reaction was the most strategically revealing response to Trump's declaration, and it was delivered on multiple levels simultaneously. At the official level, Beijing issued formal statements condemning what it characterized as unilateral American militarism threatening international shipping freedom and global energy security. The language was sharp, consistent with China's established rhetorical framework for opposing American power projection in regions it considers within its expanding sphere of strategic interest. Beneath the official statements, however, China's actual behavior in the hours and days following the declaration told a different story. Chinese diplomatic back channels to Washington activated immediately, not to protest, to seek clarification, to understand the actual operational parameters being contemplated, to determine whether the blockade declaration was a maximum pressure negotiating tactic, the kind of extreme opening position Trump routinely deploys before accepting a negotiated settlement, or a genuine operational plan being given to U.S. Fifth Fleet commanders. The distinction matters existentially for Beijing. China imports approximately 11 million barrels of oil per day. A significant portion of that comes from Russia via pipeline and from non-Gulf sources, but the Gulf component, flowing through Hormuz, represents a volume that the Chinese economy cannot simply replace from alternative sources on any short-term timeline. A prolonged Hormuz disruption would not just slow Chinese economic growth. At sufficient duration and severity, it would threaten the industrial output targets that the Chinese Communist Party uses to maintain its domestic political legitimacy. This is precisely the leverage point Trump is applying, and Beijing recognizes it with perfect clarity. Because Beijing's own strategic planners have spent years developing their own plans to apply similar pressure to American interests. Being on the receiving end of the playbook they wrote is not a comfortable experience. Iran's immediate response was defiant, structured, and, beneath the rhetoric, revealed a strategic calculation that has shifted considerably from previous confrontations. IRGC commanders issued statements declaring that any American attempt to blockade the strait would be met with force, that Iran would not permit any foreign power to control Persian Gulf navigation, that the IRGC Navy was fully prepared to respond to any act of aggression in Iranian territorial waters and the broader Gulf region. The language was expected. It was produced for domestic consumption as much as for international deterrence. The Iranian public, under severe economic stress from years of sanctions and now facing the prospect of direct military confrontation with the United States, needed to see revolutionary resolve from its leadership. The statements provided that optic. What the statements did not provide was any concrete military action. And the absence of concrete military action in the immediate period following Trump's declaration was itself the most important signal Iran sent. Because Iran's military planners had already done the analysis. They had already run the scenarios. They had already assessed the current state of American mine countermeasures capability in the Gulf, the very capability we analyzed in the previous episode, the unmanned systems and AI integrated detection architecture that had already rendered Iran's primary Hormuz denial mechanism significantly less credible. They had already examined the full scope of American naval assets positioned in the region, the carrier strike groups, the submarine presence, the air power available from regional bases, and they had concluded that a direct military confrontation with the United States Navy in the Strait of Hormuz in 2026 is not the same calculation it would have been in 2006, or even 2016. American capability has advanced. Iranian asymmetric advantages have been systematically degraded. The mine threat is diminished. The fast boat swarm doctrine has been countered by directed energy systems and autonomous surface vessels that can engage swarms without putting human crews at risk. The IRGC's defiant statements were words. The absence of mines in the shipping lanes was the real answer. Russia's position in this confrontation is one of studied, opportunistic ambivalence. On the surface, Moscow aligns with Tehran. Russia and Iran are nominally strategic partners, connected by their shared opposition to American hegemony, by their defense cooperation agreements, by Russia's sale of air defense systems to Iran, by Iran's supply of Shahed drones to Russia's Ukraine campaign. Russian official statements condemned Trump's blockade declaration in language parallel to China's. Beneath the surface, Russian strategic interests in a prolonged Hormuz crisis are considerably more complex than simple solidarity with Tehran suggests. Russia is, in the current global energy market, Iran's direct competitor. Both countries produce and export oil and gas. Both countries depend on energy revenues to fund their governments and their military operations. When Gulf oil is disrupted, Russian oil becomes more valuable. When energy prices spike because 20% of global supply is suddenly at risk, Russia's remaining export revenues, already constrained by Western sanctions, increase proportionally. A Hormuz crisis that drives oil to $150 or $180 per barrel does not hurt Russia. It is the most powerful economic stimulus available to a Russian war economy that is being slowly strangled by sanctions and technology denial. Putin is watching Trump's Hormuz declaration with the specific attention of a man calculating how long he can afford to let this situation develop before the economic benefits to Russia outweigh the strategic risks of a full American-Iranian military confrontation, reshaping the Gulf security architecture in ways that might not serve Moscow's long-term interests. The calculation is not simple, and Moscow is not rushing to resolve it. The energy market reaction to Trump's declaration was instantaneous and severe. Within hours of the announcement, Brent crude jumped sharply, with traders pricing in the risk premium associated with Hormuz uncertainty. Shipping insurance rates for Gulf transiting vessels spiked. Tanker companies began contingency planning for alternative routing around the Cape of Good Hope, a route that adds approximately 2 to 3 weeks to the voyage time from the Gulf to European and Asian markets and proportionally increases transportation costs and fuel consumption. LNG spot prices moved sharply in European markets, reflecting the vulnerability of Qatari supply that European importers have come to depend on following the reduction of Russian pipeline gas. The economic logic of a prolonged Hormuz disruption is arithmetically brutal. At 20 million barrels per day removed from accessible global supply, even for a period of weeks, the price impact would be measured not in percentage points, but in multiples. $100 oil becomes $150 becomes $200, depending on the duration and the degree of alternative supply mobilization that producers outside the Gulf corridor can execute. The United States, now a net energy exporter following the shale revolution, is in a structurally different position regarding Hormuz disruption than it was in 1990 or 2003. American consumers would see higher gasoline prices, but American energy producers would see dramatically higher revenues. The distributional politics within the United States of a Hormuz-driven oil price spike are not the same as they were in previous Gulf crises. This asymmetry is not lost on the Trump administration's calculations. America can absorb a Hormuz disruption better than China can, better than Japan can, better than South Korea can, better than India can, better than Europe can. The country least economically harmed by Hormuz instability among all the major powers is the country whose president just declared a blockade of it. That is not a coincidence. It is leverage, deliberately constructed and consciously deployed. The military logistics of an actual Hormuz blockade, as distinct from a declared one, reveal the extraordinary complexity of translating Trump's statement into operational reality. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Manama, Bahrain, is the operational command responsible for the Arabian Gulf, the Red Sea, the Gulf of Oman, and portions of the Indian Ocean. Its assets at any given time include surface combatants, submarine forces, maritime patrol aircraft, mine warfare vessels, and the carrier strike group or groups assigned to the region on rotating deployment. Enforcing a blockade of Hormuz would require stopping and boarding vessels attempting to transit the strait in both directions, outbound tankers carrying Gulf oil, and inbound tankers carrying refined products and goods into Gulf ports. At current traffic volumes, Hormuz sees approximately 100 vessels per day transiting in both directions. Stopping, inspecting, and either clearing or turning back 100 vessels daily would require a level of boarding party personnel and small boat assets that significantly exceeds what is currently stationed in the Gulf. It would also require a decision about which flags to stop. Iranian-flagged vessels? Obvious. Vessels carrying Iranian crude? More complex, because Iranian crude frequently travels under flags of convenience and ownership structures designed specifically to obscure its origin. Vessels carrying crude from non-Iranian Gulf producers? Legally and diplomatically catastrophic to stop, as it would constitute an American blockade of allied nation exports. The operational complexity transforms Trump's clean rhetorical declaration into a labyrinthine set of implementation questions that the U.S. military would require weeks of planning and significant additional asset deployment to execute even partially. This operational reality is one reason why multiple senior Pentagon officials, speaking anonymously to American media in the days following the declaration, were careful to describe the statement as establishing a policy position rather than an imminent operational order. The gap between declaring a blockade and actually running one is measured in thousands of personnel, dozens of additional vessels, and a legal diplomatic framework that does not currently exist. For the broader American strategic position in the Middle East, the blockade declaration introduces a paradox that Trump's foreign policy instincts do not naturally resolve. The maximum pressure campaign against Iran is designed to force Tehran back to the negotiating table on nuclear terms, significantly more favorable to Washington and its regional allies than the 2015 JCPOA provided. The theory is that sufficient economic pain, combined with credible military threat, produces Iranian flexibility. The historical record on this theory is mixed at best. Iran endured devastating sanctions between 2012 and 2015 before agreeing to the JCPOA. It endured Trump's first-term maximum pressure campaign between 2018 and 2021 without agreeing to anything. Its response to economic pressure has historically been to accelerate its nuclear program as a deterrence hedge, not to moderate its regional behavior, as the pressure theory predicts. A Hormuz blockade declaration, unless followed by a negotiated resolution that Tehran can present domestically as something other than capitulation to American threats, risks driving Iran further into the strategic embrace of Russia, and China accelerating rather than slowing its nuclear timeline and triggering a regional military escalation that would destabilize the very Gulf state partners whose cooperation is essential to American influence in the region. Trump's transactional approach to foreign policy has produced genuine breakthroughs in some contexts. The Abraham Accords represent a real regional transformation. His willingness to use maximum economic pressure produced a renegotiation of NAFTA and meaningful Chinese trade concessions. The approach works when the counterpart has interests sufficiently aligned with de-escalation to make a deal. Iran's revolutionary leadership structure, in which hardline IRGC commanders and ideological maximalists have systematically marginalized pragmatic factions, is precisely the kind of decision-making architecture that does not respond predictably to transactional pressure. The regime's survival logic is not economic, it is political-theological, and political-theological systems do not respond to cost-benefit calculations the way transactional negotiating partners do. The domino consequences moving through the global order from Trump's declaration are still propagating, and their full scope will not be visible for months. Europe is reassessing its energy import diversification strategy under a new urgency parameter that was not present last year. Japan is factoring the Hormuz uncertainty into its accelerated defense investment calculations, adding a new dimension to the rationale for the Terra A1 program and its broader rearmament agenda. India is quietly activating conversations with Gulf state producers about supply security guarantees that would route around any disruption scenario. South Korea is running emergency energy stockpile assessments. And somewhere in the planning cells of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, analysts are drawing a lesson from the Hormuz situation that will directly influence PLA Navy doctrine regarding Taiwan. If the United States is willing to threaten the interruption of 20% of global oil supply as a coercive instrument against a regional power, what does that willingness imply about Washington's readiness to use naval force to interrupt Chinese shipping in a Taiwan conflict scenario? The answer being drawn in Beijing's planning rooms is making the PLA's Taiwan timeline calculations considerably more complicated than they were 18 months ago. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. It has always been the place where the global economy is most vulnerable, where geography concentrates the flow of industrial civilization into a corridor narrow enough for a single determined power to threaten its interruption. For 40 years, now that threatening power was Iran. The IRGC's mines and missiles and fast boats and drone swarms were the mechanism. The specter of $200 oil was the lever. The fear of economic catastrophe was the chain that constrained every American president who contemplated military action against Tehran's nuclear program. Trump just grabbed the chain, turned it around, and put it in American hands. Whether that move represents the opening of a negotiation that ends with Iran's nuclear program verifiably constrained, or the opening of a military confrontation that reshapes the Middle East in ways no current planning model fully anticipates, that is the question that will define the next chapter of Persian Gulf history. The Navy is in position. The declaration has been made. The world is watching 33 kilometers of water with an intensity it has rarely directed at any geography in its history. What happens next in those waters will not stay in those waters. It never does.